The city was screaming, but in the center of the smoke, there was a sudden, impossible silence. Kong Tae-woo, the most feared man in the district, was stepping out of his armored car when a small hand, not a weapon, not a threat, reached for his sleeve. He looked down to see a girl no older than 6, her dark hair straight and matted with ash, her simple dress torn at the hem. While riot police and protesters clashed just a block away, she didn't run. Instead, she held up a single, crisp $1 bill with a hand that didn't shake, even as Tae-woo's men moved in like human shields. Kong Tae-woo had built his reputation on the scars that mapped his body and a cold, profitable neutrality. For a decade, he watched the city's corruption from the shadows, knowing that getting emotional was a weakness that got men killed. His Cadillac purred at the curb, ready to whisk him away from the chaos to the safety of his headquarters. He was a man who lived by rules, stay out of the politics of the street, and never, ever bring children into the business. But as he crouched to her level, eye to eye with her unwavering hope, the world around them blurred. She leaned in, cupping a tiny hand to his tattooed ear, and whispered a request that made the king of the East turn deathly pale. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was hiring a monster to fight a nightmare. The girl, Emily Carter, was methodical. She explained through quiet tears, not the sobbing of a child, but the grief of someone who had already lost everything, that her father, a journalist, had been taken by men in black suits. As she spoke, Tae-woo felt a shift in his chest. Perhaps it was the memory of his own father's disappearance, or perhaps it was the realization that the corruption he ignored had finally touched the truly innocent. "What exactly do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I want you to bring him home," she said simply. "They said you're the only one the bad men are scared of." Tae-woo looked at the $1 bill. In his world, $20,000 was pocket change, and this dollar was nothing. But as he took the money, he knew the contract he was signing was worth far more than any debt he had ever collected. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a guardian of a truth he had spent a lifetime ignoring. Kong Tae-woo didn't look back as the heavy door of the Cadillac clicked shut, sealing out the muffled roar of the riots. Inside the car, the air smelled of expensive leather and the faint, cold scent of ozone from the air purifier. He leaned his head against the headrest, closing his eyes, but the image of the girl was burned into his eyelids. He felt the weight of the single dollar bill in his breast pocket, a thin piece of paper that suddenly felt heavier than the gold bars stacked in his private vault. For 15 years, Tae-woo had survived by being the eye of the storm. While politicians bickered and rival gangs tore each other apart for scraps, he had remained the silent architect of the East Side's order. His philosophy was simple. The city could burn as long as his streets remained paved and his ledgers remained balanced. He had always believed that neutrality was the ultimate armor, a way to stay untouched by the messy, bleeding heart of the public's desperation. He had taught himself to look at a burning building and see only a fluctuation in property value, to hear a siren and see only a shift in police patrol routes. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands. They were large, calloused, and marked with the history of his ascent. A jagged scar ran across his knuckles from a fight in a rain-slicked alleyway a decade ago. Another, fainter line traced his palm, where he had once caught a blade meant for his throat. These were the maps of a man who had traded his humanity for a throne of steel. He had told himself these scars were badges of survival, proof that he was a predator in a city of prey. But as he touched the tattoo of the tiger on his neck, his skin felt cold. Outside the tinted window, the city was a blur of neon and smoke. He saw a group of protesters being pushed back by a line of riot police, their faces twisted in a mixture of fury and fear. Normally, he would have looked away, dismissive of a struggle that didn't affect his bottom line. But now, he found himself searching the crowds, wondering how many other Emily Carters were hiding in the shadows, waiting for a monster to save them. He realized then that his neutrality wasn't armor, it was a shroud. He had spent so long staying out of the mess that he had forgotten the city was made of people, not just territory. The little girl hadn't just handed him $1. She had handed him a mirror. She didn't see a criminal or a businessman. She saw the only man strong enough to stand against the dark. For the first time in his life, the power he held felt less like a weapon and more like a heavy, undeniable debt. The car glided into the shadows of a quiet side street, leaving the orange glow of the rioting district behind. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the heater and Emily's soft, hitching breaths. Kong Tae-woo sat perfectly still, his large, tattooed hand resting on the seat between them, close enough for her to reach, but distant enough to respect her space. He didn't look like a savior. With the scars crossing his brow and the dark ink tracing his throat, he looked exactly like the kind of man the world warned children to avoid. "Tell me about the men in the black suits, Emily," Tae-woo said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that seemed to steady the air. Emily wiped her nose with the back of her hand, her small fingers still clutching the hem of her dark dress. "They came at night," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "My dad, he's a writer. He spends all night at his desk with the little green lamp on. He told me he was writing a story about the shadow people, the ones who steal the city's lunch money to build their big glass towers." Tae-woo's jaw tightened. He knew those towers. He had provided the security for their groundbreakings. He understood exactly what knowing too much meant in a city built on buried secrets. He found a list, Emily continued, looking down at her worn shoes. He said the list had names of people who pretend to be good but are actually the ones starting the fires. He was going to give it to the newspapers. But then the men came. They didn't use the door. They just appeared. They told him he was interfering with progress. She finally looked up at Tae-woo, her wide eyes searching his face for a flicker of the monster she had been promised. "I hid under the crawl space like he told me. I saw them take him. I went to the police station the next morning, but the man at the desk, he wore the same silver pin as the men who took my dad. That's when I knew I couldn't go to them." "So you came to me?" Tae-woo prompted quietly. "Mrs. Chun at the bakery said the police follow the rules of the law, but you follow the rules of the neighborhood," Emily said, leaning in slightly, her innocence acting as a shield against his fearsome reputation. "She said the law is blind, but you see everything. She said if I wanted to fight a monster, I had to hire one who still remembers what it's like to be human." Tae-woo looked away, out into the dark city. He had spent years trying to forget his humanity, burying it under layers of steel and silence. But as Emily reached out and tentatively touched the scarred skin of his hand, he felt the heavy, undeniable pull of the contract he had just signed. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a guardian of a truth he had spent a lifetime ignoring. The heavy oak doors of the Bella Vista's private war room swung open, and Kong Tae-woo stepped into a cloud of expensive cigar smoke and sharp apprehension. His top lieutenants, Tony, the strategist, and Marco, the enforcer, were already hovering over a digital map of the city, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. They looked up as Tae-woo approached, their eyes immediately dropping to the small, crumpled $1 bill he laid carefully in the center of the table. "We have a problem at the docks, boss," Tony began, his voice tight. "The vanguards have doubled the security around the shipping lanes. Moving against them now is suicide. It's not just about the money. It's about the political heat. The mayor's office is tied to their payroll. If we breathe on them, the whole city comes down on our heads." Tae-woo didn't look at the map. He looked at the dollar. "We aren't going to the docks, Tony." Marco stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Then where? The warehouse district? The unions? We've got crews sitting in armored SUVs waiting for a target. What's the play?" "We're going to a private black site on the edge of the industrial zone," Tae-woo said, his voice as calm as the surface of a frozen lake. "A journalist was taken 3 nights ago. We're bringing him back." The room went silent, save for the hum of the cooling fans. Tony laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "A journalist? Boss, we stay out of that mess. That's rule number 1. Whistleblowers and press, that's a death sentence for business. There's no profit in it. Who's paying for a hit like that? The unions? A rival paper?" Tae-woo leaned over the table, his scars white under the fluorescent lights, and tapped the $1 bill. "The client is Emily Carter, 7 years old. And this is the full payment." You're joking, Marco whispered, his hand hovering near his holster. We're going to war with a state-sponsored security firm over a buck? Boss, the men will think you've lost your mind. We have rules about children. We stay away. We don't become their personal superheroes. Tae-woo straightened, his shadow stretching long across the map. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The Koslov brothers used to think they could ignore the rules of the neighborhood, too, he said, referencing the ruthless gang that had once tried to push into his territory. They thought they could take what they wanted because they were bigger. They were wrong. The vanguards think they own the shadows. They think they can take a father away and no one will care because it's just business. He picked up the dollar and tucked it back into his pocket. The contract is signed. The money is non-refundable. Tell the specialists to gear up. We aren't protectors of the law, but tonight, we're the only ones protecting the neighborhood. The mobilization began not with an alarm, but with a series of silent, encrypted pulses sent across the city's hidden frequencies. Tae-woo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, watching the rain start to smear the neon lights of the district into long, bloody streaks. Behind him, the ghosts began to arrive. These weren't the loud, heavy-handed street soldiers who patrolled the docks. These were the men and women Tae-woo kept in the periphery, specialists who didn't exist on any payroll and whose names were never spoken aloud. First came Juna, a woman with quick, bird-like movements and eyes that seemed to record every flickering shadow. She was a digital phantom, capable of ghosting through state-level firewalls as if they were lace curtains. Following her was Kale, a man whose presence was so muted he seemed to blend into the very wallpaper. He was an expert in urban extraction, a man who could walk into a fortress and leave with a ghost without tripping a single thermal sensor. The vanguards use a rolling encryption for their black sites, Juna said, her fingers already dancing across a portable terminal. They move their high-value assets every 72 hours. If your journalist is still alive, he's at the old mill processing center. It's a dead zone, no cell signals, no civilian traffic, and a private security perimeter that uses live-fire drones. Tae-woo turned from the window, his face a mask of cold, surgical intent. He didn't ask about the risks or the cost. He looked at the $1 bill resting on his desk, pinned down by a heavy brass casing. I don't want a siege, he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. I want a haunting. I want them to realize they've lost him before they even know we've breached the gate. The vanguards think they are the only ones who can operate outside the light. Remind them that the shadows belonged to us long before they bought their first uniform. Kale checked the slide of a suppressed sidearm, his expression vacant of emotion. The perimeter is tight, boss. If we go in, there's no backing out. The city elite won't let this slide. This isn't just a rescue. It's an act of war against the people who sign the checks. Then let it be war, Tae-woo replied, stepping into the center of the room. He felt the old, familiar weight of his own weapon against his hip, but it felt different tonight. It felt like a tool of balance rather than a tool of debt. They took a father because he spoke the truth. We're going to show them that some truths are protected by monsters. As the ghosts gathered their gear, black tack layers, silent comms, and specialized breaching tools, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The apathy that had defined Tae-woo's reign for 15 years had evaporated, replaced by a singular, sharp purpose. They moved out into the night, not as a mafia crew, but as a scalpel aimed at the heart of the city's darkest secret. The old mill processing center sat like a concrete tomb on the edge of the industrial wasteland, surrounded by a double layer of electrified chain-link fence and the rhythmic, red pulse of infrared sensors. From a distance, it looked like any other abandoned relic of the city's manufacturing past, but through the thermal optics of Tae-woo's binoculars, the truth was visible. The empty guard towers hummed with the heat of high-grade servers, and the shadows between the buildings moved with the precision of a paramilitary unit. Tae-woo crouched in the tall, oil-slicked grass of the perimeter ridge, his dark suit blending into the midnight gloom. Beside him, Kale was a silhouette of absolute stillness, checking the pressure on a pneumatic bolt cutter. They were a mile from the nearest street lamp, in a place where the law ended and private interest began. The main gate is a decoy. Juna's voice crackled through the bone conduction earpiece, coming from her van hidden 3 blocks away. It's reinforced with magnetic locks and pressure plates. But the drainage intake on the north wall has a vulnerability. Every 60 seconds, the internal diagnostic system cycles the security cameras for a half-second reboot. That's your window. Tae-woo watched the sweep of a drone's spotlight as it cut through the ring. This was the fortress of lies, the place where men like Emily's father were brought to be erased by people who believed their bank accounts made them gods. For years, Tae-woo had shared the city with these men, maintaining a cold, professional distance. Seeing the facility now, with its clinical, heartless efficiency, he realized that his own brand of violence had at least been honest. This was something else, a silent, corporate cruelty that flourished in the dark. Kale, you take the high ground. Disable the drones on my mark, Tae-woo whispered into his mic. We don't leave a footprint. We're here for the journalist and the truth he's carrying. If anyone gets in the way, put them to sleep. We aren't here to start a war. We're here to end one. He looked back at the city skyline, where the fires of the riots were still visible as a faint, orange haze. He thought of Emily sitting in the back of his Cadillac, her small hand cupped to his ear. He reached into his pocket and felt the thin paper of the $1 bill. It was his only compass in a mission that defied every business instinct he possessed. Timing the cycle now, Juno announced. 3, 2, 1, go. Tae-woo moved. He wasn't the king of the East Side in that moment. He was a ghost among ghosts, sliding through the gap in the perimeter as the cameras blinked. The breach was silent, a ripple in the dark that the fortress never saw coming. The air inside the processing center was thick with the smell of ozone and wet concrete. Tae-woo moved through the basement corridors like a predator in his own forest, his footsteps silenced by the chaos of Juna's digital sabotage. Above them, the building's fire suppression system had been tripped, filling the hallways with a ghostly, artificial mist that turned the red emergency lights into a blurring haze. They found him in a room that didn't exist on any blueprint, a cold, sterile box tucked behind the boiler room. Emily's father, David Carter, was slumped in a chair, his face bruised but his eyes still burning with the defiant spark of a man who refused to stop writing. "Who are you?" David rasped, squinting through the fog as Kale sliced through his restraints. "The help?" Tae-woo replied, his eyes scanning the door. "Your daughter paid the bill." The moment of relief was shattered by the shriek of a high-decibel alarm. The vanguards had realized the breach wasn't a system glitch. Heavy boots hammered against the floorboards above, and a flashbang grenade detonated in the hallway, filling the small room with a blinding white light and a roar that felt like a physical blow. "Get him behind me," Tae-woo commanded, his voice a pillar of iron amidst the noise. The door splintered as 3 Vanguard operators, clad in matte black tactical gear, surged into the room. Tae-woo didn't hesitate. He wasn't a man who relied on luck. He relied on the decades of violence that had etched the scars into his skin. He stepped into the line of fire, his own weapon barking a rhythmic, suppressed cadence. Bullets chewed into the concrete pillars around them, spraying dust and grit into the air. Tae-woo felt a sharp, hot sting across his shoulder, a graze, but he didn't flinch. He stayed low, using his large frame as a human shield for the trembling journalist. Every shot he fired was calculated, a cold subtraction from the enemy's numbers. "Move. Now," Tae-woo roared, grabbing David by the collar and shoving him toward the service elevator as Kale provided suppressive fire. The smoke was so thick now it was like breathing ash. The vanguards were closing in, their laser sights cutting through the haze like crimson needles. Tae-woo stood his ground at the elevator threshold, his face a mask of primal fury. He wasn't just fighting for a contract or a territory anymore. He was fighting for the look Emily had given him, the belief that he was the only monster scary enough to win. As the elevator doors began to hiss shut, a final volley of gunfire erupted from the hallway. Tae-woo slammed his shoulder against the steel door, forcing it closed as the bullets sparked against the frame. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of heavy breathing and the mechanical groan of the lift rising. Tae-woo looked at David, then down at the blood seeping through his own expensive suit jacket. He reached into his breast pocket and felt the $1 bill. It was still there, dry and untouched. The most dangerous man in the city leaned back against the shaking wall and finally let out a breath that tasted like victory. The service elevator groaned to a halt, but not at the ground floor. Tae-woo had Juna override the destination, bringing them instead to the executive penthouse level of the Old Mills administration wing. As the doors slid open, David Carter collapsed into the corner of the lift, gasping for air, but Tae-woo stepped out into a room that was the polar opposite of the basement's grime. The office was vast, silent, and smelled of expensive cedar and high-end scotch. Behind a desk of polished mahogany sat Commissioner Holloway, the man whose silver pin Emily had recognized at the precinct. He didn't look like a kidnapper. He looked like a pillar of the community, his silver hair perfectly coiffed even at 3 in the morning. He didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he reached for a crystal decanter. I knew the vanguards were incompetent, but I didn't think they'd let a street thug walk through the front door, Holloway said, his voice smooth and devoid of shame. He poured a glass and slid it toward the edge of the desk. Sit down, Tae-woo. Let's talk about your price. I know David's story is worth something, but I can offer you a figure that makes a journalist's life look like pocket change. 10 million. Transferred tonight. All you have to do is leave him here and walk away. We'll even throw in a citywide blind eye for your dock shipments for the next fiscal year. Tae-woo stood in the center of the plush carpet, a stark, blood-stained contrast to the room's elegance. He looked at the glass of scotch, then at the man who had ordered a father to be erased to protect a balance sheet. For 15 years, this was the kind of deal Tae-woo would have taken, the smart business move. You think we're the same, Tae-woo said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. You think because I have scars and you have a title, that we both just trade in lives. Don't get pious with me, Holloway snapped, his composure finally slipping. You've killed for less. I've killed for many things, Tae-woo admitted, stepping closer until his shadow eclipsed the commissioner's desk. But I've never lied to a child about it. You broke the only rule that matters in this city. You made the innocent pay for your greed. Tae-woo reached into his pocket and pulled out the $1 bill. He dropped it onto the mahogany desk. It looked small and pathetic against the expensive grain of the wood. The contract is already paid in full, Holloway, and I don't take bribes to break my word. Before the commissioner could speak, the doors burst open again, not with Tae-woo's men, but with a different group of ghosts. Juna had leaked David's files to every major news outlet and the Internal Affairs Division 5 minutes ago. As the sirens finally wailed in the distance, Tae-woo turned his back on the money and the power, walking toward the man he had come to save. He had chosen justice, and for the first time, the weight of his sins felt just a little bit lighter. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic drizzle by the time the Cadillac pulled back into the quiet side street where the world had first tilted on its axis. The smoke from the distant riots still hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the chaos Tae-woo had finally stopped ignoring. Inside the car, the silence was no longer heavy with dread, but with the fragile, exhausted peace of a battle won. Emily was waiting exactly where he had left her, huddled under the awning of a closed flower shop. When the car doors opened, she didn't look at the armored vehicle or the scarred men stepping out of it. Her eyes were fixed on the man stumbling out behind Tae-woo. "Daddy!" The word was a small, piercing cry that broke the stillness of the night. David Carter collapsed onto the pavement as Emily collided with him, her small arms wrapping around his neck with a strength that seemed impossible for her size. Tae-woo stood a few paces back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching the reunion through the steam rising from the wet asphalt. He felt like an intruder in the presence of such absolute, unshielded love. After a long moment, David looked up at Tae-woo, his eyes wet with tears and clouded with a confusion that would likely take weeks to clear. "I don't know how to thank you," he rasped. "I don't even know who you are." "It doesn't matter," Tae-woo replied, his voice a low, steady anchor. "Your daughter is the one who settled the account." Tae-woo reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the $1 bill. It was slightly damp now, the edges softened by the night's events. He stepped forward and held it out to Emily. "The job is done," he said, his face softening into a rare, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "You should keep this. Buy something for your father. He's had a long night." Emily looked at the dollar, then up at the man she had called a monster. She didn't take it. She reached out and pushed his hand back toward his chest, her small palm warm against his leather glove. "No," she said firmly. "A deal is a deal. You kept your promise. Now you have to keep the money, so you remember that you're one of the good guys." Taewoo's breath hitched. For 15 years, people had given him money out of fear, greed, or desperation. No one had ever given him anything to keep him good. He slowly folded the bill and tucked it back over his heart. "I'll keep it safe, Emily," he promised. "I'll keep all of you safe." As he watched them walk toward their apartment, David's arm around his daughter's shoulders, Taewoo realized the scars on his knuckles didn't ache for the first time in years. He wasn't just a king of a broken city anymore. He was a man who had finally earned his keep. The street fell back into its natural rhythm of distant sirens and the low hum of the city breathing. But for Kang Taewoo, the silence felt different. He watched David and Emily disappear into the stairwell of their building, their shadows merging into one before the heavy security door clicked shut. He remained on the sidewalk for a long time, the rain soaking through his silk shirt, feeling the unfamiliar warmth of a conscience that had finally been awoken. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the $1 bill one last time. It was a flimsy piece of paper, weathered and small, yet it carried the weight of a blood oath. He remembered how his face had turned white when she first whispered her request, not because he was afraid of the vanguards or the commissioner, but because he was terrified that a child could see a spark of goodness in him that he had spent 15 years trying to extinguish. "Boss, we need to clear out," Tony said softly, stepping up beside him. "The precinct is in a frenzy. IA is already making arrests at the processing center. If we're seen here, the connection becomes official." Taewoo didn't move. He looked up at the glowing windows of the apartment buildings, seeing the thousands of lives tucked away behind brick and glass. For a decade and a half, he had viewed these people as a crop to be harvested or a nuisance to be managed. Now, he saw them as the reason for his power. "Let them look," Taewoo replied, his voice a low, resolute growl. "From now on, the rules of the neighborhood change. We aren't just collectors anymore." He returned to the Cadillac, but as he sat in the plush interior, he didn't ask for the partition to be raised. He pulled a small, silver frame from the glove box, a relic intended for a photograph of his own father that he had never been able to find. Instead, he carefully smoothed out Emily's $1 bill and placed it behind the glass. "Tony," Taewoo said, staring at the frame. "Find out who else the vanguards were holding. Find their families. Ensure they have what they need to get through the month. And tell the crews, if I hear of a single person in this district being touched by those men in black suits, I want the names on my desk by morning." The car began to move, gliding through the wet streets like a shark in dark water. Taewoo watched the city pass by, no longer an apathetic king, but a silent guardian. He knew the elite would come for him eventually, and the legal monsters would try to reclaim their territory. But as he touched the frame, he felt a strange, ironclad peace. He was a man of his word, and his contract with the girl was for a lifetime.